So, since the Sex Discrimination Act was passed in 1984, it was only 2 years until the Equal Opportunity for Women in the Workplace Act was then passed, which is the predecessor of WGEA, which is what we call the agency I work for. And that's gone through various iterations. And the focus has always been on private sector employers having an accountability to understand what's happening in terms of gender equality in their workplace, and seek to improve it. And the Act has a cycle of a 10-year review, and so about every 12 or 13 years, the Act has evolved, as a result of those reviews in terms of what happens next. So there was a next iteration in 1999, and the current Act is 2012 in terms of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, Workplace Gender Equality Act. And what we do is we are that regulator, and from an employer's perspective, what the law requires them to do is to report to us every year on their gender equality indicators, and they're specified in the Act. So things from the composition of their workforce, the composition of their board, remuneration between men and women, policies in place for flexible work and to support parents, consultation on gender equality, and now also sexual harassment and discrimination. It provides a framework for employers to collect the information and then WGEA to report back to them on how they're performing, both absolutely and relative to a peer group. And that's really been, for the last 10 years, what WGEA has done. And the premise being that knowing that information, having that information back, having the comparative information, and also being able to drive a broader national conversation is a catalyst for change. And I think it has been. When we have a look at the gender pay gap, which is the measure we use as the proxy for gender equality, it's not perfect, but it's the best one we have, that has been coming down over the last 10 years. And while it's very hard to show a causal relationship, it is unanimously agreed that WGEA has contributed to that progress. So we've got to the point where the 10-year review was to occur again, and that occurred in 2021 and coincided with when I started with the agency. And that's when we've had a catalyst to talk about the policy that we're going to talk about today in relation to the next wave of change for gender equality in the workplace. So WGEA had articulated a concern that workplace gender equality was stalling after the Act had passed in 2012. But what we were seeing is a slowing of the reduction in the gender pay gap. And in fact, we had 2 years where the gender pay gap was exactly the same. It was a real prompt to say, we've relied on the Act and the nature of reporting for the last 10 years in terms of improving gender equality, but perhaps there are now other things that are needed to make sure that we can build the momentum up. So it was quite a shifting dynamic as well, but the sense was that the Act in its current form had achieved much of what it was hoped to, as what it was able to achieve, and additional elements were needed to reignite and to accelerate change. The gender pay gap reflects both pay and composition. So many of the things that WGEA measures and many of the elements that are so fundamental to gender equality are captured in the outcomes we see about both our structure of our workforces, but also the structure of our industries, in that often feminised industries are lower paying, masculinised industries are higher paying, and the fact that we have so many more men in senior paying roles and women in lower paying roles. So the gender pay gap is a good proxy for gender equality, and that measure had slowed in terms of its progress. So the focus on accelerating change, as measured by the gender pay gap, has been the focus and the objective, and that's how we measure success. The Workplace Gender Equality Amendment Act, which was titled Closing the Gender Pay Gap, was introduced in 2023. and it took a subset of the recommendations from the review of the Act and enacted them legislatively. Probably the highest profile and the one with the biggest impact is moving to publishing gender pay gaps for employers. So while we had always calculated gender pay gaps and given them confidentially back to employers about their own performance, the Act specifically precluded us from any publication of those gender pay gaps. And so that restriction was removed, and in fact a positive requirement for us to publish gender pay gaps was introduced. There's a few other critical things that the bill also did. Is it also required that the WGEA reports that we provide, which are an executive summary of their results, but also an industry benchmark report, are required to go to the board. And what that was solving is twofold. One, we'd seen from the UK, who have been publishing gender pay gaps for 6 years, that there was a significant increase in the debate and discussion at the board level in relation to gender equality. So the WGEA reports provide a lot of that context and information. But we'd also noticed internally that many were not downloading their reports. So their performance and the comparison wasn't being utilised because they weren't even being downloaded. So the requirement to provide the WGEA reports to the board to inform that discussion. There was also a broader capturing of information that we'd previously not been able to. So previously, CEO remuneration was not included in the data that we could collect. So we were calculating a gender pay gap without CEO REM being included. And of course, we know that approximately 80% of CEOs are men, and it's the highest paying role. So we were understating the gender pay gap by not having that information as part of it. And it enabled the collection of some other aspects of data, such as an employee's age and employee's location, so we can start to do some intersectional analysis in relation to our data. And finally, because of all the work around respect at work, which has been so important in terms of shifting culture in our workplaces, that previously sex-based harassment, sexual discrimination had not been an explicit indicator on which we collected information, and that was included in the Act as well.